All right, lights, camera, action.
All right, well, we're here in the Maggot Clubhouse today, and it's my very great pleasure to actually be talking with a living legend. I know that's a term that gets overused, but in this case, it's true in this time and place. Rex, welcome, and really glad to have you here.
Thanks, Matt. It's good to be back in Missoula.
Awesome. Hey, a couple of things. How does someone from Christchurch end up in Missoula, Montana? Because that's the story. That's the question I've always wanted to ask you.
Well, I went down to Otago in Dunedin as a student when I was 18 and ended up wanting to get higher qualifications in somewhere in the US before going on to Canada. That was the original plan. And I wrote to about 75 different universities in the US. All the ones that wrote back and told me I had to take English as a foreign language, I cut them off the list. And I ended up with two real choices in the finish. One was Missoula and the other was the University of Bridgeport in Connecticut. And the guy who was head of the University of Montana Foundation sent me a whole lot of colour brochures about Missoula and all of the surrounding wilderness areas and lakes and mountains, and I was sold, so I ended up here.
And did it meet your expectations when you got here? Did it look like the brochures?
It did, but it probably exceeded my expectations because I ended up with an excellent supervisor at the University of Montana, and that made it a very good decision indeed.
And how long were you here for? Just to do the master's program?
Well, really, I was here just for a summer session plus a year, a full 2 semesters. And then I went up to the University of Alberta in Canada, but it was only 500 miles away, so I kept on coming back, and for obvious reasons ended up doing my PhD in Alberta, but using the university team as subjects for my dissertation.
And we'll get back to that because I know that's a good story. Growing up in a rugby hotbed like Christchurch, obviously New Zealand, but Christchurch itself even more so. What was your experience with rugby when you came here afterwards?
Well, I'd been a player at high school. I actually went to a very strange primary school in Christchurch. It only had field hockey in the winter. It's probably the only school in the country that didn't offer rugby. And so it was an unusual beginning, really. The New Zealand field hockey team won the gold medal at the Olympics in Montreal in 1976. And of that team, 7 had gone to that primary school. Wow. So it was very successful. But as soon as I came into town, when I was about 9, I went to a school that offered rugby as well as field hockey and other sports, and I started playing rugby then and played it right through high school.
So rugby there, as we all know, New Zealand, really the place where rugby is the biggest thing available. What was the difference like when you came here and what you found when you got to the University of Montana for rugby?
Well, I mean, it was a totally different game here. And when I first arrived in Missoula, there was a New Zealander who actually went to the same university as I did in Dunedin, and he advised me not to have anything to do with the University of Montana Rugby Club, and so I followed his advice and tried to ignore them for as long as I could.
And do you know how long they had been going here before you got here?
They'd been going, I arrived in 73 and I think they started in 68.
Okay.
But they hadn't played a lot of rugby because it was so hard to find teams to play against. I think the closest opposition we had when I came was Trail in BC.
Oh, wow.
So, there was a lot of travelling, and they probably didn't average more than, a handful of games each year. And the one thing that I tried to do was to get them more games so that they would have more opportunities. That's once I started coaching them.
Right, and in those days, I think it was very similar where I've always thought that coaches are born, not made. So did you have any coaching experience before you got here?
Yes, I did. I'd coached a, what do you call it? There was a boarding school, boarding house attached to the high school that I went to in Christchurch, and I ended up there as a housemaster at one stage, and I coached the hostel team.
Oh.
And then I ended up going to a farm training school in the North Island, and basically coached all the sports there, including the rugby, and had a couple of really good teams there too.
And so, what was the level of understanding of rugby of the guys that were here playing? Was it any actual rugby players at that time? Or?
Well, I mean, there were a few that had experience under Henry Bird, who was the first coach, the Irishman, but he hadn't done a lot of coaching. He'd sort of disappeared from the scene a bit, I think. And so they were really learning from each other, learning from one or two players who'd had experience in other places other than Missoula. But they didn't have a lot of experience. And I know that first year, when we ended up going on a tour down to the Club National Championships in Monterey, California, there were a significant number who had never actually seen a game of rugby before we started the tour.
So clean slate for your coaching.
A clean slate, yeah. I mean, we all the practices were in the field house because it was the grounds were frozen and under snow outside. So over the winter, all the training was in the field house, and it's not easy to develop scrums and lineouts in a field house, but it served the purpose.
And what did you see in that initial group of people here at the University of Montana that made you want to keep coming back? What got you?
That's a bit difficult. If you want to know what I saw in the team in terms of their performance, there were a lot of very good athletes in the team. Some of them had excelled in other sports like wrestling. There were one or two very good football players. Some of them, I think, one or two tried out for the Grizzlies. Okay. And so there was differing levels of ability, but some very good athletes, but lacking in some of the basic skills in rugby. And I can remember we had a fullback by the name of Skipper, and I'm sure he'll forgive me for this. The first time I saw him kick the ball, he threw the ball up in the air in the in-goal area and took a wild swing at it and missed it completely. And someone dived on it for a try, and I thought, well, there's some basics still to be learnt here.
And how long was it after you got here till when you felt like they were actually a rugby team?
Well, I think when we took off on that first spring tour, I quite frankly wasn't expecting them to be able to beat anyone because there just wasn't enough overall experience in the team. And we lost the first couple of games, but I'm pretty sure the third game was against the Eugene Rugby Club in Eugene, Oregon, and we actually won that one. I think it was about 9-3 or something like that, and that was a very good surprise for me, and I know that the team really enjoyed their victory. I think it was their second victory in history, because I think they'd only won one game before that season. So it was a rare victory, but a good one. Yeah,
and what was different about their approach to rugby and sport in general that was different from what you were used to in New Zealand, obviously?
Yeah, I think totally different. They played rugby because they wanted to play rugby, but they also loved to party. And this was what scared me off them to start off with, because I'd heard these wild tales about how much they enjoyed the game after the game. and I think New Zealand obviously is much more serious about the game, and I'd never seen people enjoy the game as much as they did, even though they weren't winning. And that takes a bit of doing. You know, you've really got to love the game to play the game for that many years and only have one win and still be happy playing the game. So that was a real eye-opener. And
as you got used to the players not knowing anything about rugby, which had to be very different from New Zealand, obviously, how did it alter your coaching style for this particular team and these people? Well, it really made you think about all of the basics. We had a number 8 by the name of Cousins, who, when we arrived at Monterey, the first team that we played against was Stanford, and Stanford were perennial national club champions. And we had a close game against them, and towards the end of the game, we had a scrum right on the goal line, and Cousin was the number 8, and the scrum wheeled and the ball went over the goal line, and all Cousin had to do was detach and fall on it, and he would have scored a try. And I hadn't taught him that. Right. So he thought he had to stay in the scrum and not detach, and that was, the end of that game. Right. But it was a very close game, and very enjoyable. And a lot of these players that you're obviously mentioning some names now, these are people that are still your friends 50 years later. Yes, yeah. The friendships have been very enduring because, my visits here have probably been 10, 20 years apart, some of them, and I can come back to Missoula and with the players from the team and feel as though I was with them last week. It's very easy to slot back in, and the memories are all pretty positive ones. And is that a rugby thing, do you think, or is that a hybrid of the Rugby-Montana experience? I think it's more the Rugby in Montana experience. I can think of people that I used to play rugby with at home, and I don't have any contact with any of them at all, I don't think. There's one that I played with in high school who I'm still in occasional contact with, but over here they're still good friends, and this is 50 years ago. So yeah. Now, when you came back and forth between Alberta and here, what was it about what you saw with this team that made you think, hey, this is a pretty good subject for my dissertation? Well, I discovered the area that I was working in at Montana. I hadn't ever had any background in sociology, and my supervisor was actually one of the early leaders in the specific area of sociology of sport. And I ended up doing a master's degree on the age-old idea that if you could get more kids to play sport, they would be less likely to get into trouble. It's the old go out for sports and stay out of the courts. Yeah. And I thought this would be a good thing to try and test. And so I was looking at whether the ones who played local football, how they fared in terms of their behaviour. The only problem was, at the end of it, I found that there wasn't really any strong correlation either way. But the one thing that was clear was that a lot of these athletes, the local footballers and basketballers and others like that, what was happening was the sheriff was letting them off. So it wasn't surprising. Well, perhaps we better cut that. I shouldn't say the sheriff was letting them off. They were getting through the system without the same sort of penalties that might have happened to other kids. And at the same time, I was coaching a team who I thought had the most deviant patterns of behaviour I'd ever seen in my life. And I thought, well, this doesn't make sense. Here am I trying to see whether kids who play sport are less delinquent or deviant, and I'm coaching a team that is
full of deviants. And so that was why when I went to the University of Alberta, I stayed in touch with the team, because I realised I could get a very interesting dissertation out of looking at their behaviour and trying to explain it, and also trying to explain how it was different from some of the deviance that was occurring in the major sports like football and basketball and what have you.
And what were those differences? I mean,
well, the difference was the Montana rugby players certainly were deviant, but a lot of their deviance wasn't illegal, whereas with the deviant behaviour of the footballers, basketballers, people like that, a lot of their deviant behaviour was illegal. I mean, a number of the assaults that took place on the campus while I was there were basketballers against ordinary students, were footballers against ordinary students, and they were assaults, both physical and sometimes sexual.
Right.
So quite a difference in the type of behaviour. The rugby players, I thought, probably went out of their way to shock people, right. but they seldom harmed people.
Right.
Except for the girls who got bitten on the backside. They might say, well, I was injured.
Right.
Yeah.
Different time, different place.
Yes.
Yeah. Different kind of thing. So you're here, you've done your dissertation, now you're back in New Zealand, and then you brought these guys down with you to New Zealand. What was that like?
Well, I was very nervous about it because having coached them over here and seen the way they behaved, I really tried to find places where I could hide them in New Zealand and where there was no strong local media and that sort of thing. So I had them come down to start the tour in Dunedin and played them against my students, the physical education students, and another team, social team at the university. And as social teams are, they enjoyed themselves in the same way as these guys did. And so it was successful in Dunedin, but I know that their final party while they were in Dunedin took place at a local fitness centre with a sauna and hot tubs and what have you. And all of the faculty that I worked with came along to it, and it was the biggest eye-opener they're likely to ever have in their lives. From there on, it was the same. They played a social team at Lincoln College, which is just out of Christchurch. The team was called the Flying Zoobricks. Their logo was a penis and large balls with wings on, a bit like Pegasus, but so they obviously had the right attitude, so they were reasonably safe there. And then they went to major centres like Waipawa, probably a population of a few hundred, Te Puke, a population of maybe a few thousand, and then Kaipara Flats, which had a population of about 3. So they were fairly well hidden the whole tour, and they had a marvellous tour.
Yeah. And then you also had teams come back up here, right?
Yes. Only once actually, twice. The first team, which a former Maggot player by the name of Ken Hodge came with, I was meant to be leading that tour, but when I saw the group that was gathered together for the tour, I said, no, I don't want anything to do with it. So I let them go by themselves, and I'm very glad that happened, because if I'd been with them, I'd probably have been arrested and deported. That was the first team, and then a couple of years later I bought a university Colts team, under 20 or under 21. But it was at the wrong time of the year, and I got into a bit of trouble with the rugby union back home for taking people away in supposedly the playing season. So after that, we had to come in our summer, which was Missoula's winter, and it was
Right.
not possible to tour here then, so
Right.
it moved down south.
So when you went and after coaching here, you went back, and I know you were involved with the university club there in Dunedin. Did you have to alter your coaching methods, or did it give you a real a better look at how to coach rugby after being here?
I think certainly I coached to start off with mainly in the Colts teams, and really enjoyed that, and was, you know, the teams were very successful. I had the only 4 teams in the history of the Varsity Rugby Club that were unbeaten were all coached by me. At the junior level, at the Colts level, I was a good coach. At the senior level, I was not anywhere near good enough. When you've got All Blacks playing for you, they know twice as much as you do. And they tend to dominate no matter what the coaches say. And even when I had co-coaches who probably knew more than I did, they were the teams were still run by the All Blacks.
By the All Black guys, yeah. And I think it's still the most All Blacks of any club in New Zealand, right?
Yes, it has. Yeah. And an awful lot who became All Blacks after they left, after they graduated and moved to other centres. Yeah, I think there were 9 All Blacks and about as many other internationals who were playing for the club when I was coaching them.
Wow.
Yeah. John Leslie was one who became captain of Scotland, and he was a very good player.
Yeah. So when you were here, the guys were playing in the university, and then, you know, obviously they were you involved in the start of the Maggots at all, or
only in the fact that I did everything I could to stop it happening. The whole time I was with them, there was the question of what might happen when they'd graduated, and there were no firm rules, so they they did keep playing for the university even after they'd graduated. But sooner or later, it was obvious that if the game was going to prosper, you needed to have more than one club.
right?
And I think they were right in getting the Maggots started, even though it was probably a year earlier than what I was hoping. As it turned out, they were right. The university team continued to exist, and the Maggots went from strength to strength. So it was okay.
It worked.
It worked.
And do you remember the formation and the taking of the name the Maggots? Because, you know, there's a lot of apocryphal stories out there.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that they're considered apocryphal, because I think it was, I thought it was reasonably straightforward. As far as I know, they were called the Missoula All-Maggots as a token of respect for the All Blacks, and that the emblem on the jersey of the All Blacks, which was a silver fern, there does seem to be some doubt as to whether they actually recognised that the All Blacks played with a silver fern, because the circle of maggots that became the symbol for the All-Maggots is much more like the English rose. And whether they got things a bit mixed up, or whether Henry Bird was playing a joke, who would know? He was gone by then, so I don't think he can have influenced it. But I did wonder why it didn't look anything like a silver fern. But who knows?
We don't know.
Perhaps some of the others might be able to answer that.
Right. Now, when you look back and you think, okay, you're here now, and 50 years ago, did you think that this was going to happen, that the Maggots would continue and that the university would continue? I know they're not playing now, but I think there's plans for that to be rectified.
Yeah, I hope they would. I don't think I could have seen then how much it would continue to develop, because it isn't just Missoula now. I mean, there are teams all over the state. And if you'd said to me, oh, do you think they'll have a state championship in the years to come, I'd have said, well, it's hard to see that happening.
Yeah.
Now, of course, I come back 50 years later, and there is high school rugby for both boys and girls all over the state in different cities. I wouldn't have seen that happening, and it's very rewarding to see it. They've done some great work, and most of those clubs, as far as I can make out, have been started by former players of the university or the Maggots, or both.
Yeah. I think all over. I think it'd be most of them, I would guess.
Yes, I would think so.
It'd be most of them.
Yeah.
Now, when you must have gone to some of the early Maggot Fests, and I know we've just had a Maggot Fest here. Is that the same, or what's changed there?
Well, the only thing I can compare it with, because I never saw a Maggot Fest when I was here. They started after.
Okay.
And I think the first Maggot Fest I went to was only 5 years ago.
Oh, okay.
But I do recall going to the Mud Bowl tournament in Portland, or may have been Portland. And the idea of playing about 3 games on the Saturday and another couple on the Sunday was so foreign to me. I couldn't believe it. I thought, how can anyone play 5 games on a weekend? Because that's totally foreign back home. That just doesn't exist. It used to exist in sevens rugby, which was very low key in New Zealand and was ignored for years because 15s was king.
Right.
But they were the only ones that ever played tournaments, and the idea of a 15-a-side tournament was unthought of, so very unusual.
Strange.
Yeah, very.
Now, when you look back at all of the different players and the different teams, there must have been some epic road trips that you were on with the Jester teams.
Yeah.
There's got to be some. What sticks out in your mind? A couple.
Well, I guess the first one that sticks out in my mind was that original tour down to the
polo fields. Yeah.
It sticks out for a number of reasons. One being the fact that we'd been on the bus. Well, first of all, I should tell you, I wasn't intending to go on that tour. I'd been busy organising it, but I'd never intended going on it, because when I first agreed to coach them, I said to them I wouldn't be going to any of their away games because I knew what their behaviour was like, and I was worried about getting into trouble and being associated with them. Anyway, about 2 weeks before the spring tour took off, I made some comment to one of the players. I can't really remember who now, but it seemed to me as though he was thinking that I was going with them. And I said, you realise I'm not going on this tour. I said, I'm organising it for you, but I'm not going on it. And he was pretty upset. And when he told the rest of the team, they were very upset. And I started to feel bad. I don't know why, but in the finish, I agreed to go. And we'd been on the bus about 20 minutes, and whoever I was sitting next to on the bus went and started sniffing the air and said, the rope smokers are at it. And I didn't know what he was talking about. I was very naive about marijuana. I'd never seen it before. I'd never heard of anyone who'd ever used it before. And I arrived here and I was playing golf on the university course, and someone offered me a drag, and I said, no, I've got my own, and pulled out a packet of Marlboro. And they sort of looked at me as though I was very weird.
Yeah.
Well, that scared the daylights out of me, and as the tour went on and I found that the driver was the least drunk person who was designated to drive, I was thinking, my God, I'm taking my life in my hands here. But the night that we won a game in Eugene against expectations, I'm afraid I let my guard down a bit, and it's the first time I've ever smoked marijuana. And I ended up running around the neighbourhood without